They didn't just tear down a bridge, they tried to erase my way in and out of my own life. And for a minute there, standing at the edge of that canyon, staring at empty air where steel used to be, I honestly wondered if they thought I'd just give up. What they didn't realize is, when you corner someone on their own land, you better be real sure they don't know the rules better than you do, because I did. I've owned that property for a long time, longer than most people hold on to anything these days. 42 acres of rough, stubborn land out past Black Hollow Canyon, the kind of place that doesn't pretend to be easy. There's a seasonal creek that cuts through it, dry half the year and angry the other half, and a ridge line that catches the wind just right at sunset. It's quiet out there in a way that gets under your skin, makes you either fall in love with it or run the other direction. I stayed. Back in 2004, I built a bridge. Not some slapped-together wooden thing either. I mean a real structure, steel beams, proper footings, engineered plans stamped and approved, county inspections, the whole deal. Took me almost a year between permits, weather, and money, but when it was done, it connected my land to the county road like it was always meant to be there. That bridge wasn't just convenience. It was access, legally protected access, tied to an easement that had been recorded decades before I ever bought the place. Without it, getting in or out meant a 15-mile detour through old fire roads that washed out every time it rained, and sometimes didn't even exist anymore. I remember the first time I drove across it after it passed inspection, slow, careful, like I didn't trust it, yet even though I'd watched every bolt go in, there's a kind of pride that comes with building something that actually matters, something that changes how you live. That bridge changed everything. For years, it was quiet out there. A few neighbors, mostly folks who liked being left alone. Then one spring, the signs went up on the land next to mine, big glossy boards talking about Redwood Crest Retreat and luxury wilderness living. I remember standing at the fence line reading it, thinking, well, that's going to change things. They bought about 200 acres bordering my eastern line. Big investment group out of the city, money that didn't blink at terrain or logistics. Cabins, spa buildings, guided hikes, the whole curated nature experience. You know the type, sell people the illusion of getting away from everything, while making sure there's still heated floors and curated wine lists waiting for them at night. That's when I met Evan Cole. First time he showed up, he walked right up my bridge like he owned it, sunglasses that probably cost more than my first truck, boots that had never seen real mud, and that kind of smile that never quite reaches the eyes. He had a surveyor with him, tripod set up, measuring, marking, taking notes like they were mapping a future that didn't include me. I stepped out onto the bridge, leaned on the railing, watched them for a minute before saying anything. Sometimes silence makes people show you who they are faster than questions. Finally, I said, "You planning on telling me what you're measuring, or should I just guess?" Evan didn't look surprised, just turned, gave me that same polished smile. "Existing access points. We're doing a full site assessment. On my structure? Well," he said, glancing down at his clipboard, partially on shared boundary lines. "Just gathering data." There was something about the way he said data that rubbed me wrong, like he'd already decided what it meant before he even finished collecting it. "That bridge is permitted," I said, keeping my voice even. "And it's tied to a recorded easement." He nodded like he already knew, which I'm sure he did. "Of course. We're just being thorough." Then he turned back to his surveyor like the conversation was over. I stood there a second longer than I needed to, watching them work. Something about the whole thing felt off. Not illegal. Not yet. But like a line had been drawn somewhere I couldn't see. 2 weeks later, I left early in the morning to pick up supplies. Just a routine run into town. It took longer than expected, hardware store delays, grabbed lunch, lost track of time. By the time I got back out there, the sun was already starting to drop behind the ridge, casting everything in that deep gold light that usually makes the place feel calm. That day, it felt wrong before I even got close. You ever have that feeling, like your body notices something before your brain catches up? That's what it was. The air felt off. Too still. I rounded the bend where the road dips toward the bridge, and I hit the brakes so hard the truck skidded. There was nothing there. No railing. No steel beams. No deck. Just open space and the creek bed 20 feet below, and fresh-cut marks along the edge where the structure had been torched apart. For a second, I just sat there, engine running, hands still on the wheel, not even processing it. It didn't make sense. You don't just remove a bridge. Not one like that. Not without permits, notices, paperwork, something. Then I saw the excavator, parked on the far side, on their land, arm extended down into the creek, lifting twisted sections of steel onto a flatbed truck. Sparks still faint on some of the cuts. This hadn't happened days ago. This was recent. Today, maybe hours. I got out of the truck, walked to the edge slow, like if I moved too fast it might somehow come back. Ridiculous thought. But your brain does strange things when reality shifts under your feet. I shouted across, "Hey!" The operator looked up, killed the engine, climbed down like he'd been expecting someone eventually. "What the hell is going on?" I called out. He wiped his hands on his vest, didn't meet my eyes right away. "Just doing what I was told, sir." "Who told you to cut my bridge apart?" He hesitated, then jerked his thumb back toward their property. "Site manager. Said it was a safety issue." I actually laughed at that. Short, sharp, no humor in it. Safety issue? That bridge passed inspection 2 years ago. He shrugged, uncomfortable. "I don't make the calls." No, he didn't. But someone did. I pulled out my phone, already knowing who I was about to call. Evan picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said, like we were neighbors chatting over a fence. "What can I do for you?" I looked out at the empty gap where my bridge used to be and felt something settle in my chest. Not panic, not even anger exactly, something colder. "You can start by explaining why your crew just destroyed my access road." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me he'd been expecting this call. Then, calm as ever, he said, "We had our engineers review the structure. It didn't meet the safety standards required for our future guests. It posed a liability risk." I let that sit for a second. "That's not your call to make," I said quietly. "Well," he replied, tone smooth, practiced. "It becomes our concern when it affects our development. You're welcome to construct a new bridge that complies with current codes." And just like that, he'd rewritten the situation in his head. I stared out at the canyon, the fading light catching on the exposed earth where the footings used to sit, and realized something. This wasn't a mistake. This was a move. And he thought I didn't have one to answer it. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even argue. And I think that might have been the first thing that threw him off. Because guys like Evan, they expect noise, they expect emotion, they expect you to swing before you think. What they don't expect is silence followed by paperwork. I just said, "You might want to call your lawyer," and hung up before he could respond. Then I started taking pictures. Every cut beam, every scorch mark, the excavator serial number, the company logo on the truck, tire tracks, footprints, everything. I walked the entire edge of that canyon like I was documenting a crime scene, because in my gut, that's exactly what it felt like. I even climbed down into the creek bed, boots sliding on loose rock, and took close-ups of the steel where they'd sliced it clean through. That wasn't collapse. That was deliberate, controlled removal. By the time the light was gone, I had a couple hundred photos and a phone battery hanging by a thread. The drive into town that night felt longer than usual. Not because of the distance, but because every mile gave me more time to think about what he'd said. Liability risk. That phrase kept looping in my head. It sounded official, like something backed by law, by authority, but the more I turned it over, the more it felt like a cover, not a reason. I didn't go home. I went straight to Margaret Hale. Margaret's office sits above an old insurance building downtown. Nothing fancy, just a brass nameplate and a door that sticks in the humidity. But she's been practicing property law for over 3 decades, and around here, when land gets complicated, her name comes up whether you like it or not. She's the kind of person who doesn't waste words, which is exactly what you want when things are already messy. She looked up when I walked in, glanced at the clock, then back at me. "This better be good," she said. I set my phone on her desk and started scrolling through the photos without sitting down. They tore out my bridge. That got her attention. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she watched image after image. The cut steel, the empty span, the equipment. She didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just let the evidence stack itself in silence. When I finished, she sat back slowly, folded her hands, and said, "Start from the beginning." So I did. The easement, the permits, the inspection reports, the neighbor purchase, Evan, the survey, the call. She didn't react much while I talked, just took notes in that neat, tight handwriting of hers. But when I mentioned that the bridge had been fully permitted and inspected recently, she stopped writing. "You have copies of those documents?" "Digital and physical." "Good," she said. Because what they did, she paused, choosing her words carefully, isn't just trespass. I waited. She looked me dead in the eye. They interfered with a recorded legal access easement. That's not a small problem. That's a very expensive one. There it was. Not anger. Not outrage. Certainty. She pulled her laptop closer, fingers moving fast across the keys. We're not waiting on this. If your access is gone, that's immediate harm. We file emergency relief. Tonight. She glanced up. You want your bridge back. That was all the answer she needed. The next few hours blurred into paperwork, document scans, pulling archived permits, engineering certifications, inspection approvals, everything tied to that bridge and that easement. Margaret moved like someone who'd done this 100 times, efficient, focused, no wasted motion. At one point she muttered, almost to herself, they didn't even try to cover this properly, which, coming from her, sounded a lot like disbelief. By the time we finished, it was well past midnight. She printed the filing, slid it into a folder, and said, be at the courthouse at 8 a.m. and get some sleep if you can. I didn't. The next morning felt like stepping into a different world, fluorescent lights, polished floors, people in suits moving with purpose, all of it a sharp contrast to the dirt roads and open sky I was used to. I met Margaret on the courthouse steps, coffee in her hand, already reviewing notes. You ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. The hearing itself didn't take long, which, in hindsight, said a lot. Margaret laid everything out clean and direct. The recorded easement from decades back, the legal right of access, the permitted bridge, fully compliant, recently inspected. Then the photos, the part where the judge leaned forward slightly, studying the images of the cut steel. The opposing side had a lawyer there. Young, sharp suit, probably very good at what he does, but he didn't have much to work with. Their argument leaned hard on safety concerns, claimed their development team had identified structural risks that could affect future resort operations. The judge didn't even let him finish that sentence. Was there a county-issued notice of condemnation? He asked. The lawyer hesitated. No, Your Honor. Was there any legal order authorizing removal of that structure? No, Your Honor. The judge nodded once, then looked down at the file again, flipping a page. So, to be clear, he said, voice steady. Your client unilaterally removed a permitted structure that provides the plaintiff's only reasonable access to his property without legal authority. Silence. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then he looked up. Access is to be restored within 72 hours. Just like that. No drama. No raised voice. But it landed harder than anything else in that room. Outside the courtroom, I finally exhaled, didn't even realize I'd been holding it. Margaret didn't celebrate. She just checked her watch. Clock started the moment that order was issued, she said. Now we see what they do. I didn't have to wait long. Evan called that afternoon. His tone had changed, not completely, but there was something tighter under the surface now. 72 hours isn't realistic, he said. Reconstruction of a structure like that requires planning, materials, approvals. You had time to tear it down. I cut in. Figure it out. A pause. Then he shifted tactics. We're willing to work with you on a replacement, he said. Something updated. Safer. More in line with the overall aesthetic of the development. I actually smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. You don't get to redesign my access, I said. You rebuild what you destroyed. You're missing an opportunity here, he replied, a hint of impatience creeping in. We're talking about improving your property value. No, I said, voice steady. You're talking about controlling it. That hit. I could hear it in the silence on the other end, that brief moment where the conversation stopped being about logistics and started being about something else entirely. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said finally. I looked out over the canyon again, the gap still sitting there like an open wound in the land. You already did that, I said, and hung up. Day 1 passed. No construction. Day 2, still nothing. By the morning of day 3, I drove out to the site early, parked at the edge, and just watched. No crews. No materials. No movement. They weren't going to meet the deadline. And I think part of me already knew why. It wasn't about time. It was about pride. Guys like Evan don't like being told to undo something, especially not by a judge, and definitely not for someone they've already decided is in their way. So instead of fixing it, he waited. And that was the second mistake. I called Margaret from the truck. They're not doing it, I said. I figured, she replied, like she'd been expecting that exact sentence. Come back in. We're going to court again. This time felt different. Not urgent. Inevitable. The second hearing didn't have that same quiet uncertainty as the first one. This time, it felt like everyone in the room already knew how it was going to go. They were just there to watch it happen. Margaret didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. She simply laid out the timeline, the order, the lack of compliance, and then stepped back like she'd just placed the final piece on a board she'd been setting up from the start. The judge didn't look impressed. He flipped through the file, glanced at the previous order, then over at their side of the room. 72 hours, he said. That was not a suggestion. Their lawyer tried. I'll give him that. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, started explaining logistical constraints, material sourcing delays, coordination issues, all the right words, all the right tone, but none of it answered the one question that actually mattered. Did your client make a good faith effort to begin restoration? The judge asked. There was a pause, just a fraction too long. No, Your Honor. That was it. You could almost feel the shift in the room. The judge leaned back slightly, exhaled through his nose, then said, all development activity associated with the defendant's project is hereby suspended pending full compliance with this court's order. He didn't stop there. Permits are to be reviewed. Any work in progress is to cease immediately. It was clean, direct, total. Outside the courthouse, I saw Evan for the first time since that phone call. He was standing near the steps, talking fast into his phone, pacing just enough to show he was trying not to pace. When he spotted me, he stopped. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he walked over. You just cost us millions, he said, low enough that no one else would hear, but sharp enough to carry weight. I shrugged slightly. No, I said. You did that when you cut my bridge down. His jaw tightened. You could have worked with us. I let out a quiet breath, looked past him toward the street, then back. You never planned to work with me. That landed somewhere he didn't like. This isn't over, he said. I nodded once. No, I agreed. It's not. And that was the last real conversation we ever had. Because after that, it stopped being about me. Once the county started digging into their permits, things unraveled faster than anyone expected, and I mean fast. What started as a compliance review turned into a full inspection sweep, and suddenly every part of their project was under a microscope. Margaret called me a week later. They used your bridge in their site plan, she said. I frowned. What do you mean? As designated guest parking access. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably bold it almost deserved respect. They planned their whole layout around something they didn't even own. Worse, she said. They listed it as future controlled infrastructure. There it was again. Control. And it didn't stop there. Their water rights application, incomplete. The seasonal creek that ran through the land, the same one under my bridge, barely mentioned. Turns out, that matters when you're planning a resort that needs a steady water supply. Their septic design exceeded what the soil could legally support. Their fire access roads didn't meet minimum width requirements for emergency vehicles. Some of their grading work had already started before final approvals were fully locked in. Individually, maybe manageable. Together, it painted a picture, and the county saw it. Permits started getting pulled. First one, then another, then entire sections of the project flagged for violation. Red tags went up across the site like warning signs you couldn't ignore even if you tried. I drove past one morning a few weeks into all of it, couldn't help myself. The place that had been buzzing with activity just a month earlier was quiet. Equipment parked, materials sitting untouched, temporary fencing half secured like someone had just stopped mid-motion and walked away. That's the thing about big projects. They look unstoppable from the outside, like momentum alone will carry them through anything, until suddenly, it doesn't. Investors started getting nervous. Funding gets real sensitive when timelines slip and legal issues. Those don't just delay things, they multiply risk. I heard through a mutual contact that one of their primary backers had pulled out, then another. 8 months. That's how long it took from the day my bridge disappeared to the day Redwood Crest filed for bankruptcy. 8 months. I was back out on my land the day I heard the news, standing near the rebuilt bridge. Yeah, they did rebuild it eventually. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice left. They rebuilt it exactly as it was. Same structure, same alignment, same access. I walked across it that evening, slow, same way I had the first time years ago, not because I didn't trust it, but because I understood something now that I hadn't back then. It wasn't just steel and bolts. It was leverage. It was boundaries. It was proof that just because someone has more money, more people, more plans, doesn't mean they get to rewrite what's already been set in place. The sun was dropping behind the ridge again, same golden light, same wind moving through the trees, and for a second, everything felt exactly like it used to. But it wasn't, because now, every time I look at that bridge, I don't just see what I built. I see what someone else tried to take, and how close they got to thinking they could. Here's the part one still think about, though. If Evan had just come to me first, had an actual conversation, laid out what they wanted, asked instead of assumed, things might have gone very differently. Maybe we would have worked something out. Maybe not. But they didn't. They chose force over permission, speed over process, control over respect. And in the end, that choice cost them everything. So I'm curious, if you were in that courtroom, sitting in that judge's seat, would you have made the same call? Or do you think there's a version of this where both sides walk away with something? Let me know what you think, because out where land and law collide, the line between right and wrong isn't always as simple as it looks.